At first glance, the Edwardian world appeared immaculate. Between 1901 and 1914, Britain glowed with prosperity and polish. Carriages rolled through London's wide boulevards, parlors gleamed beneath gaslight, and etiquette ruled conversation as strictly as law. To be respectable was to be composed. Every sigh was to be suppressed, every tremor disguised behind lace gloves and polite smiles. Yet beneath that serenity, countless lives were unraveling in silence. The turn of the 20th century was a time of contradictions. Industrial progress beside spiritual exhaustion, luxury beside loneliness. Doctors called it the age of nerves, and few escaped untouched. Before we begin, pour yourself a cup of tea, let the modern world fall away, and step with me into an era that prized composure above compassion. I'm Dame of Legends, and tonight we'll lift the silk curtain on Edwardian mental health, the diagnoses, the asylums, the gendered expectations, and the war that finally forced a nation to listen. The Edwardians did not yet possess the language of psychology. Instead, they spoke of nerves. In 1869, American neurologist George Beard coined the term neurasthenia, nervous exhaustion. It described fatigue, insomnia, heart palpitations, anxiety, even despair. Beard blamed the modern world, telegrams, railways, electricity, women's education. By the 1890s, the diagnosis crossed the Atlantic and was embraced by London's elite physicians such as Dr. George Henry Savage, superintendent of Bethlem Royal Hospital, better known as Bedlam. Neurasthenia became fashionable. It offered a respectable explanation for malaise, not madness, but over-civilization. The patient was not weak. He was simply too refined for the pace of modern life. Men and women experienced it differently. For men, it was a badge of intellect. The overworked lawyer, the scholar whose brain burned too brightly. For women, it was moral caution, evidence that ambition and emotion must be restrained. The same diagnosis that excused a gentleman's breakdown condemned a lady's curiosity. Other terms floated through medical journals: melancholia for depression, mania for agitation, moral insanity for behavior that defied decorum. Psychiatry was still entangled with morality. A troubled mind was seen not only as unwell, but unbecoming. Behind these words was a deep unease. Britain was moving faster, trains, telegraphs, global trade, yet medicine feared the cost of progress. The human mind, once thought eternal, seemed suddenly fragile. When polite society could no longer conceal distress, it turned to institutions. By 1900, more than 100 public asylums housed over 100,000 Britons. They were meant as humane alternatives to prisons, but they mirrored the hierarchies outside their walls. The wealthy entered private retreats like the York Retreat or Holloway Sanatorium, where patients strolled among gardens and attended musical evenings. Their case notes speak of delicate nerves and rest cures at the seaside. For the working classes, reality was harsher. County asylums such as Colney Hatch, Hanwell, and Broadmoor overflowed. Dormitories lined with iron beds contained hundreds. Attendants earned a pittance and worked 14-hour shifts. Many inmates were not violent, but simply poor, widowed, or exhausted. Victorian reformers had envisioned asylums as moral communities of routine and labor. Patients gardened, sewed, scrubbed floors. Useful occupation was thought to restore sanity. But by the Edwardian years, overcrowding had turned them into warehouses of despair. Medical treatments reflected uncertainty. There was hydrotherapy, hours submerged in warm or cold water to balance circulation. Electrotherapy, mild shocks to stimulate nerve force. Sedatives like chloral hydrate dulled agitation but chained thought. The most notorious was the rest cure, invented by American doctor Silas Weir Mitchell. Popular among British physicians, it confined patients, usually women, to bed for months. Reading and writing were forbidden, conversation limited. Heavy cream and meat diets were prescribed to restore weight and docility. Writer Charlotte Perkins Gilman endured the rest cure and transformed her experience into The Yellow Wallpaper, 1892, a story of a woman driven mad by enforced idleness. A generation later, Virginia Woolf would suffer the same prescription under Dr. George Savage himself. She later reflected, to be shut in bed, forbidden to think, was a form of dying. Some doctors meant well, but psychiatry still sought control, not understanding. As one report from 1907 concluded bluntly, the patient's chief enemy is their own mind. Discipline must replace indulgence. Few subjects reveal Edwardian prejudice more starkly than gender and mental health. For centuries, medicine had linked women's emotions to their reproductive organs. The ancient Greek term hysteria, from hystera, meaning womb, endured into the 20th century. A woman who cried too freely, spoke too loudly, or defied expectation might be labeled hysterical. Doctors described symptoms so broad they encompassed half of womanhood. Fainting, anxiety, irritability, loss of appetite, sexual desire, lack of desire, rebellion, grief. Whatever did not conform became diagnosis. Treatments ranged from chloroform sedation to surgical removal of ovaries and clitorises, procedures justified as curing nervous instability. The celebrated gynecologist Robert Lawson Tate performed hundreds of such operations in Birmingham by 1900. Society encouraged the myth. Magazines warned that study or ambition would drain a woman's vital energies. Universities like Cambridge resisted granting women full degrees partly on medical grounds. Education was thought to cause hysteria. Men were not free, merely differently trapped. They were expected to embody strength and composure, the so-called stiff upper lip. To admit fear or sadness was effeminate. Those who faltered were treated for neurasthenia, but only briefly. Their cure was to resume work. The double standard ran deep. A woman's suffering questioned her virtue. A man's questioned his courage. In both cases, silence was safer than confession. Into this world crept the ideas of Sigmund Freud. His early essays on repression and dreams reached Britain through journals and lectures around 1908. A few young physicians, notably Ernest Jones, found them compelling, but the establishment scoffed. Talking about sexuality or childhood trauma was indecent. The British preferred their madness tidy, their emotions private, and their patients quiet. Mental health in Edwardian Britain was not only a medical issue, it was economic. Working-class people lived lives of relentless labor. 12-hour factory shifts, coal dust, cramped housing, malnutrition. Each eroded both body and mind. But society saw exhaustion as laziness, despair as vice. Social investigators Charles Booth and Seabohm Rowntree mapped poverty in London and York. Beyond wages and rents, they noticed something subtler. A visible dullness of spirit, the hopelessness of those who work without rest. Yet policymakers turned to eugenics for answers, claiming degeneration, not deprivation, caused misery. In 1913, the Mental Deficiency Act legalized the confinement of those deemed feeble-minded or morally defective. The language was broad enough to include unmarried mothers, epileptics, orphans, and the poor. It was the state's attempt to tidy society's conscience. Over 60,000 people would be institutionalized under its clauses in the decades to come. Meanwhile, charitable institutions like the Salvation Army and church missions offered soup, prayer, and moral lectures, but little understanding. mental illness was still seen through the lens of sin. At the opposite end of society, the idle rich were encouraged to travel, taking the waters in Bath, visiting Swiss sanatoria, or retreating to the countryside. What money called convalescence, poverty called madness. In this contrast lies the heart of Edwardian injustice. The same despair that earned a countess a spa treatment earned her maid a cell. When the Great War erupted in 1914, Edwardian civility met industrial slaughter. Trench warfare introduced unrelenting terror, artillery barrages, gas, the sight of friends obliterated. Soldiers began collapsing without visible wounds, trembling, mute, paralyzed, or trapped in endless nightmares. The Army's initial response was discipline. Officers accused them of cowardice. Some were executed for desertion. But by 1916, the phenomenon could no longer be denied. Doctors like Charles Myers coined the term shell shock. At hospitals such as Craiglockhart War Hospital in Edinburgh, psychiatrist Dr. W.H.R. Rivers took a revolutionary approach. He listened. Among his patients were poets Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen, whose verses transformed private agony into public awareness. Rivers realized that trauma was not weakness, but an injury of the mind, the brain's response to unbearable memory. His work helped shift psychiatry from punishment toward compassion. By war's end, more than 80,000 British soldiers had been officially diagnosed with shell shock, though the true number was likely higher. Their suffering exposed the limits of Edwardian stoicism. The stiff upper lip had shattered under artillery fire. When these men returned home, they carried with them a quiet revolution. For the first time, society confronted the idea that mental wounds were real, and that they could affect anyone, not just women or the poor. After 1918, Britain changed, but slowly. The Edwardian world of rigid class and gender hierarchies dissolved into the uncertainties of modernity. Psychiatry evolved from moral management to medicine. Former asylum doctors became psychiatrists. Madhouses were renamed mental hospitals. The Mental Treatment Act of 1930 finally allowed voluntary admission and outpatient care, small steps toward dignity. Virginia Woolf, now an acclaimed writer, transformed her own experiences into literature that captured both beauty and despair. In Mrs. Dalloway and the Waves, her characters wrestled with the same unspoken pain that filled asylum ledgers a generation earlier. The Freudian movement gained foothold. London's Institute of Psychoanalysis opened in 1924 under Ernest Jones. Yet public attitudes lagged behind. Newspapers still mocked the nervously inclined. Working-class Britons feared asylums as social death, and veterans with shell shock received pensions grudgingly, if at all. Nevertheless, the seeds of change had been sown. Out of Edwardian repression grew the beginnings of empathy, a recognition that minds, like bodies, could fracture and heal. We live today with vocabulary the Edwardians never had: depression, anxiety, trauma. But the habits they taught us linger. The smile that hides exhaustion, the fear of being a burden, the instinct to call suffering weakness. Their world built elegant prisons of silence. Ours still carries the keys. The next time we speak of mental health, perhaps we should remember those who could not. The women silenced by hysteria, the men trembling in trenches, the nameless thousands in asylums who worked in gardens and laundries, forgotten yet human. The Edwardians mastered the art of appearing fine. Our task is to master the courage of honesty. If you found this story illuminating, please like and subscribe. It helps these quiet histories reach more hearts. And if you'd like to support the work behind these videos, visit Sugar Spice Apparel Company, where bits of history and legend are stitched into every design. I'm Dame of Legends, and until next time, remember, Even silence leaves a record.